Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be answering that question that I get pretty frequently, which is how many fabrics are too many fabrics? This is a really important question because kind of conceptually, every designer seems to understand that there is a point where you have way too many fabrics in your fabric requirements and you need to start paring it down. But when do you actually hit that point? I'm going to talk about a couple of scenarios. Now, this is really subjective, so this is kind of my opinion, having read a crap ton of patterns over the years. But it is just an opinion, so I'm going to hopefully offer you some things to think about so you can make this decision for yourself. All right, let's get into it. The first kind of bin of designs that I see are these kinds of abstract designs. These are just kind of contrast and shapes. It's a very typical modern design. This particular one is the Carbide Quilt by Modern Moon Quilt Studio. It's gorgeous. But again, it's not really depicting anything. These are just kind of shapes and contrasts to get a beautiful pattern, right? So in this particular instance, my general rule of thumb is stick to about 6 or less fabrics. Because in general, these fabrics are going to be a bunch of different cuts, all different cutting instructions, right? There's not really a lot of consistency between cuts. There's things you can do to address that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But generally speaking, that's not really a criteria for these things, right? Each block of color is going to be cut differently, and it occupies a specific spot in the quilt in order to get the shape and the contrast that you're looking for, which is totally fine. But if you're in that boat, 6 is about the max that I like to see. Any more than that, it starts to become really overwhelming for your customer to understand where the fabrics are going to end up in their quilt, and also select fabrics that all work together when they're in a quilt shop, because they need to know exactly which fabric is going to go in each position at the time of purchasing, because each quantity is going to be different, right? And so once you get to about 6, that process gets really overwhelming, right? Because you kind of go back and forth. Do I want this one here? Maybe I'll switch it a different position. Now, if I've bought the exact quantity, I can't do that, right? I'm locked in from the get-go. And that can be really constraining for some quilters. So that's kind of my rule of thumb, is about 6 or less. If there are things you can do to kind of keep the cuts a little bit more consistent, do that, right? Any amount that you can do that and help kind of make it easier to digest what fabrics are going to end up where and envision the final quilt for your customer, that can be helpful, right? But sometimes with abstract designs, there's just only so much you can do. Let's talk about a second scenario, which is what I like to call picture piecing. These are things that depict real life things. So usually like animals or, some sort of object. This particular example is an Elizabeth Hartman pattern, very iconic pattern. It's called Little Llamas. And you can see that the piecing is done in such a way that it looks like a real llama, which is really cool. For those kinds of quilts, you tend to need a lot of fabrics. It's just the way it works, because you're trying to depict something that has a real life counterpart, right? There's a real object that you're trying to mimic with that quilt design. And so having specific fabrics in specific places, either by color or just by kind of the number of them and the contrast that you're getting from them, is really, really important to that. So sometimes it's really hard to limit the number of fabrics that you can deal with in that particular instance. And if you're really falling in love with something that's just kind of scrappy, you have a ton of fabrics in there, that's okay. But what I want you to think about is trying to keep a lot of those fabrics down to small quantities, right? It's much, much easier to buy lots of small quantities of fabric in, say, like a fat quarter quantity or a layer cake, right? Because you can buy a pack of layer cakes and get a bunch of different fabrics within there. So if you've got to use a lot of fabrics, try and keep them to a pre-cut size, so you're not trying to buy a bunch of different cuts of yardage, which just gets really annoying. Again, with picture piecing, there's only so much you can do, but if you can keep most of those cuts to like a small quantity that's easy to purchase in a fabric shop, that helps your reader kind of comprehend what they need to get and gather all of their supplies without it becoming overwhelming for them. Another kind of color scheme that I see a lot is an ombre quilt. This is one of my favorites as well. And ombres are difficult because you need a certain number of fabrics in order to get that gradient look that you're trying to get. And that's just the way it is, right? Like that's legitimate justification for including more fabrics, but I still try to keep it to around 10 or less. And you want to try and keep those cuts fairly large and similar in quantity, right? You don't want to have like a quarter yard of this and 1 1/4 yard of that, and then 3/4 of the next one, right? And it jumping all around. If you can, try to keep them fairly consistent and fairly large chunks of fabric. Now, again, an ombre design is justification for including more fabric. So if you have to, you have to, but just think about whether or not you actually need that many steps in your fabric scheme, or if you can kind of combine some of those color bands and get away with a little bit less number of fabrics. The final example that I have for you is actually a really good example of what not to do. So this is a scenario that I've unfortunately seen a lot. Now, this particular example is not an example of what I'm about to talk about. I don't want to out anybody by pulling up their quilt because this is something you definitely want to avoid. This particular example that you see is Mosaic Star by Lo and Behold Stitchery, and it is a fat quarter quilt. But what I have seen too often with some of the patterns that I tech edit is taking something that otherwise could be a fat quarter quilt or, you know, some sort of standard cut, right? You buy 8 3/8 yard cuts of fabric and every single one's cut the same way. They take that and they rearrange the fabric in such a way that not every single piece of fabric is cut the same. And you need different quantities of each, right? So it's almost like this arbitrary fabric placement. And you can see how they got there, right? They started with this quilt design and they just started playing with the colors until they got something they liked and they fell in love with that. And that's their cover quilt. There's nothing wrong with that, but when you're trying to commercialize it as a pattern, you have to play a little bit of a different game. What I have seen too often, for instance, is instead of just having this pink fabric occupying each position once, which is kind of what you see here, right? You would take all fat quarters, you'd cut them the same way, and then you just kind of mix up the pieces so that you get nice variety. What I've seen all too often is that they'll pick 6 blocks that have it all in this position, and then maybe 2 other blocks where it's in some other position, right? And that's unique to maybe that dark fuchsia color. And then the next color, right? It's 5 blocks in a certain position and 3 blocks at another position, and then it's used a little bit elsewhere, right? And it just gets chaotic, right? Not only are your cutting instructions going to be different for each fabric, but now you've got different quantities of fabric depending on the fabric type. So what that means is that when your customer goes into a shop to buy their fabric for the project, they have to know exactly which fabric is going in each position. They have to know exactly how much fabric of each to buy, which means usually when it's this complicated, they have to bring the pattern in with them, right? And maybe they forgot it that day because they just happened to stop at the shop on the way home from work and forgot to bring it, didn't realize they were doing it that day, right? You can see how this just becomes really, really annoying. So whenever you can, have a think about the placement of the fabrics in your quilt to see if you can get the cuts to either be more uniform, if you can reduce the number of fabrics you need, or if you can get them onto a pre-cut quantity. So if you need a lot of fabrics, it's very easy to just go and select that from a fat quarter bin or just buy a layer cake that's got, 20 or 30 different fabrics in it already. Really what I'm trying to say here is just make sure that once you've got a design that you love and you're getting ready to write a pattern for it, you stop before you go any further, right? Before you do quilt math, before you start writing the pattern, before you start sewing a sample, stop and look at your design and ask yourself, do I need this many fabrics? Can I rearrange things a little bit to get the cuts more uniform? Can I make fabric placement a little bit more strategic so that it's easier for my customer to kind of wrap their head around the fabrics that they need and where they're going to end up in the quilt so that they make the best decisions about their fabric choice to end up with a quilt that they're happy with? That's really the name of the game. If you haven't kind of addressed that point and you're just kind of going with the number of fabrics that you ended up with as you're playing around with the design and just finding something that you like, there's a very good chance you're going to end up in a situation where you've got either too many fabrics or fabrics that aren't really distributed in a logical way for your reader to digest easily. And that's what we want to avoid, because there's nothing worse than overcomplicating something for no real reason, right? If you're not really getting a benefit from it, then why would you do it? And too frequently I see patterns that are doing just that. They're adding complexity so that you can achieve a fabric placement that the designer fell in love with for the cover quilt, but it doesn't really work for any other different fabric combinations. You always want to write your patterns thinking about your customer first, not the fabric choices that you fell in love with. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you today. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you back here next week for another Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.